Hello my audiences, it's Andrew, and welcome to my first Honorable Mentions video. Today, I will be discussing 5 honorable mentions for my top 10 extinct British steam locomotives list. These will consist of locomotives I forgot, should have put in the place of some others, and classes I had not even heard of in the first place. So without further ado, here are 5 more extinct British steam locomotives, aka my top 5 honorable mentions for that list. Honorable mention number 5. The Southern Railway Z-Class. Designed by Richard Monsell, there were just 8 of these 3-cylinder 080 tank engines built, all of which by the Southern Railway's Brighton Works in 1929, numbered 950 to 957. The Southern Railway needed new powerful tank engines to work in its marshalling yards around London and on freight transfers between them. Robert Urey's G16 480s performed the task well, and further examples were on order in 1922, but Richard Monsell considered the firebox to be too large and the superheater an unnecessary expense on such locomotives. He therefore cancelled the order in favor of a new design in the form of the Zs. The 08T wheel arrangement of the Zs provided maximum traction while enabling them to traverse turns in the yards, and do so better than the G16s. They were initially supposed to be built at Ashford Railway Works, but Richard Monsell decided to construct the Z-Class at Brighton, in response to the Southern needing to unexpectedly rebuild the A-Class 264s into tender engines following the derailment of engine 800 that revealed stability issues with the Ks. The result of this relocation was the Z's boilers using the design of Douglas Earl Marsh's C3060s. The Zs were used for shunting trains in the Southern's larger marshalling yards at Feltham, Hither Green, Norwood Junction, Exmouth Junction, and Eastleigh, and proved to be very popular with locomotive crews. They were less successful at Nine Elms Yard as the buffer beams overhung the ends of the locomotives by 11 feet, or 3.35 meters in total, which could be a disadvantage when negotiating tight turns in a confined space during shunting. The design was so successful that the Southern planned a second order of 10 locomotives from Eastleigh Works, but the order was cancelled in response to the economic climate or crisis of the Great Depression. Their abilities to move heavy freight also resulted in some of them being loaned to the War Department to move troop trains and war materials over the winding routes in Scotland from December 1942 to May 1943. These were considered rare by locomotive crews as the customized inside valve gear meant the regulators worked in a different fashion than normal, and thus caused problems for those unfamiliar with the design. Speaking of World War II, it was during this time that the entire class was also replaced by the lackluster ex-London, Brighton, and South Coast E2s at the Hither Green Yard, probably because war conditions turned against the Z's favor. Finding this out during my E2 video research was also how I first heard of the Z-Class locomotives. Following the 1948 nationalization that created British Railways, the Zs had 30,000 added to their road numbers, were repainted in BR Freight Black, and given the power classification of 7F. The latter of which showed the strength of these ex-Southern locomotives. As British Railways began ordering diesel shunters in the 1950s, the Zs were gradually transferred to less demanding work at the Brighton and Tonbridge freight yards. They were later moved to the western region of British Railways, where their tractive effort made them suitable for banking trains up the steep bank between Exeter St. David's and Exeter Central stations. But with the 1962 reorganization of the western region, the Zs were withdrawn by British Railways as they weren't Great Western Railway or BR standard designs, and they were all cut up by 1965. A private attempt was made to save engine 952, or 30,952, but that attempt was unsuccessful. Had it been successful, the engine would have been the sole surviving Z. Honorable mention number 4. The London, Midland, and Scottish Patriots. Not only did I forget to include this class as an honorable mention, but I also wasn't interested in this class. Sorry. Anyway, the LMS built 52 of these Fowler-designed triple-cylinder 10-wheelers from 1930 to 1934 in Crewe Works, with 2 of them being rebuilt from the London and Northwestern large Claughtons. Of the 50 more, the first 40 were also rebuilt from regular Claughtons, and the last 10 being built from scratch. The rebuilt locomotives initially attained their road numbers, only to be renumbered in 1934. The Patriots were numbered 5500 to 5551, and some carried names. They were used to pull express passenger trains and occasional freight trains on the LMS system, and spent the bulk of their careers in England, primarily on the West Coast Main Line. The design of the Patriots was basically the frames based on that of the Royal Scots combined with the boilers of the large Claughtons, earning them the nickname of Baby Scots. Between 1946 and 1949, 18 Patriots were rebuilt with Standard 2A boilers, cabs, and tenders, with the rebuilds being based on the rebuilt Royal Scots. The Patriots eventually had 40,000 added to their road numbers following the creation of British Railways in 1948, and repainted into, you guessed it, British Railway Green.
Of course!
Withdrawal of the class began in 1960, and the last of them were retired by 1965, and scrapped shortly afterward. But hope isn't lost for this class. The LMS Patriot project is building a replica of 5551, the last Patriot built. Initially nameless, the replica will be named the Unknown Warrior. Work began in 2008 and was expected to be finished in 2018, but that deadline wasn't met. As of today, the 5551 is close to being finished, but what it will be is currently unknown. Honorable mention number 3. The Great Western 2600s. Also known as Albaderes, the Great Western Railway initially built one prototype locomotive, numbered 33, but later renumbered to 2600 in 1912. They eventually built 80 more, numbered 2601 to 2680, of these William Dean designed moguls at their Swindon works from 1901 to 1907. The design of the 2600s was a 260 freight version of their Bulldog and 4100 class 440s. This included having outside frames, meaning that it sat between the driving wheels and the external coupling rods, a feature also found on classes like the famous Cities, for example. The 2600s were used for pulling coal trains between Aberdare, South Wales, and Swindon, which is what gave them the nickname of Aberdares. Withdrawal of the class took place from 1934 to 1949, but some were reactivated during World War II. Of the prototype and 80 built, only 12 of them were inherited by British Railways, and by August 1948, only 4 of them remained active. The last of the 2600s were withdrawn in 1949, and scrapped with none to spare for preservation. There isn't much else, if any, info on this class aside from what I found. It still does make them a decent honorable mention. Honorable mention number 2. The London and Northeastern V4s. 262 Prairie Tender locomotives were very rare in the United Kingdom. In fact, only 3 classes of Prairie Tender locomotives ever existed in the country. Those in question were the Midland Railway's failed Patriot, Sir Nigel Gresley's mass-produced V2 class, and his latter V4s. When it came to the V4s, there were just 2 of these built, both of which by Doncaster Works in 1941, numbered 3401 and 3402. They hold the distinction of being the last locomotives designed by Gresley before his death on April 5th of 1941. 3401 was named Bantam Cock. 3402 was never named, but was known unofficially as Bantam Hen, similar to how Union Pacific 844 is unofficially named the Living Legend, just being nicknamed that. Compared to Gresley's previous Prairie Tender engines, the V2s, the V4s had a similar mechanical layout and some cosmetic features to the V2s and were used for the same jobs, that being mixed traffic use. But the V2s were older, larger, heavier, and more powerful than the V4s, but had very limited route availability, thus unable to traverse the entire London and Northeastern network. The V4s, on the other hand, thanks to being lighter and smaller, could traverse the entire London and Northeastern network, and thus places the V2s couldn't, and therefore more versatile. They also had a higher boiler pressure of 250 psi compared to 220 on the V2s. Bantam Cock had a scaled-down version of a Gresley Pacific boiler with a grade area of 28.5 square feet, and 3402 had a fully welded steel firebox with a single thermic siphon for water circulation. The V4s were tried on the Great Eastern section of the London and Northeastern, where they were well received by staff, proving to be better riders and more powerful than the problematic B-17s, which I really should have put the V4s in the place of on my original list. Yeah. Anyway, the design of the V4 was so successful that the railway anticipated that more V4s would be built. Sadly, the plan fell through when Sir Nigel Gresley died in office. Furthermore, Gresley's successor, Edward Thompson, instead decided to adopt his really successful mass-produced V1s as the railway's standard mixed-traffic locomotives instead of the V4s. Granted, the B1s were simpler to maintain than Gresley locomotives thanks to being a simpler design and not having a middle cylinder nor Gresley valve gear, the latter of which was especially hard to maintain. Not to mention, Thompson preferred simpler designs, but I'm sure his preference for the B1s over the V4s probably still did have to do something with Thompson not liking Gresley nor his designs. And the fact that the standardization program Thompson started not only centered on the B1 boiler, but more importantly showed his dislike toward Gresley's engineering. Anyway, the V4s were also used on the West Highland Main Line in Scotland, despite their wheel arrangement not making them particularly suitable for the grades on that line. Thompson never messed around with the V4s, but they did eventually get renumbered to 1700 and 1701 by his 1946 renumbering scheme, and as a result, eventually became British Rail 6 1700 and 6 1701, instead of 6 3401 and 6 3402 like newcomers to British steam would expect. Sadly, British Railways had both locomotives withdrawn and scrapped in 1957, when their boiler certificates expired. But just like the Patriots, hope isn't lost for the V4s. The people who formed the A1 Trust and built Tornado, and are currently building the next B2, Prince of Wales, announced that once the Prince of Wales is finished, that they will begin building a new V4. The V4 will be number 3403, the next in the sequence, but currently hasn't been given a name yet. The project is estimated to take half a decade, and there are already parts for the V4 at Darlington Locomotive Works, including a complete set of tires, a chimney, and the speedometer drives from a British Rail 08 diesel shunter. If all goes to plan, the sole surviving V2, Green Arrow, will no longer be the only surviving 262 tender engine in the UK, but among two of such, when the new V4 is finished. Before I move on to number 1 and some more honorable mentions, how about some dishonorable mentions? Now for some honorable mentions not seen on the original list. And now for the number 1 honorable mention. The Great Northern J-23s, also known as the London and Northeastern J-50s. Unlike the P2s in the original list, which had something to do with me being a London and Northeastern Grizzly fan, I picked this class for a very different reason, which I'll point out in a bit. Just like the V4s, these tank engines were also designed by, you guessed it, Sir Nigel Gresley. 102 of them were manufactured at Doncaster and Gorton Works between 1913 and 1939, with Doncaster building all but 14 of them. Looking at the time gap, you can tell right away that similar to the A1s, some of them were finished before the grouping of 1923, and others before the grouping of 1923, which created the LNER and the other Big Four railways. The first 40 were built in 2 batches by the Great Northern from 1913 to 1919, and the rest were built by the London and Northeastern in 4 batches from 1929 to 1939. More orders were placed for 25 more in 1939 and 1941, but for some reason they were cancelled in 1942 with a number of components already made. They were known as J-23 in the days of the Great Northern, and reclassed to J-50 and J-51 by the London and Northeastern. Each version was also divided into subclasses for every batch, and each batch was slightly different, as shown by this Wikipedia screenshot. Some of them were built using the original boilers from the Great Northern L1s, which Gresley rebuilt with larger boilers to replace the old ones, thus how these old L1 boilers ended up being reused by some of the J50s and 51s. This is also why they were initially divided into J51s and J50s, the latter of which had larger boilers than the former. But soon, all of the J51s were rebuilt into J50s from 1929 to 1935. Unlike most Gresley designs, the J50s had just 2 inside cylinders since they were just inside cylinder locomotives, and they also used Stephenson valve gear instead of Gresley valve gear. But I'm assuming it's because that stuff wasn't invented until 1915. The engines were nicknamed submarines because of their long tanks, which stretched all the way from the smoke box and sloped down at the front, which was an unusual feature for most tank engines. The J50s were used for shunting in various yards and short hauls across the London and Northeastern network. Numbering was initially all over the place, but they were eventually renumbered collectively to 8890 to 8991. Now, the main reason I ranked these as number 1 on this list was because of something I learned about these things from 3 people who commented on my E2 review. Thomas the Tank Engine was originally supposed to be based on a J50. But when the creator of Thomas the Tank Engine, Wilbert Awdry, found out that the illustrator for the Railway series was a Southern enthusiast, he made Thomas into a London, Brighton, and South Coast E2 instead. And that didn't work the best, since Thomas is known as a really useful engine, and the E2s were the polar opposite. Useless and absolutely crappy locomotives. Had Thomas been based on the J50s, he wouldn't have to suffer from having a crappy basis, and the E2s wouldn't be as over-infamous nor misunderstood by some as much as they are now. Because the J50s were good locomotives and proved to be better than the E2s. Granted, they wouldn't be able to traverse turns that the S100s could, and still would have been squished to create Thomas's model, as well as also use different tank designs, but the J50s were still stronger and a bit shorter than the E2s, thus better power for their size, and didn't have a reputation of consuming way too much water, and they would have for sure been better passenger locomotives thanks to larger coal and water capacity, and probably would have been smoother riders. Furthermore, they proved to be good at more than just shunting, while the E2s were only good at shunting, but absolutely rubbish at anything else despite having pulling freight trains in mind. The J50s eventually had 60,000 added to their road numbers following the creation of British Railways. They continued working with BR until being replaced by diesel shunters. Following this, the locomotives were all withdrawn from 1958 to 1965, and every single one of them was scrapped. There was an attempt to build a new J50, but the project only made little progress and eventually closed. The fact that these locomotives were originally supposed to be the basis of Thomas, and how much less hated and infamous the E2s would have been had Thomas been based on the J50s instead, lands these Gresley tank engines the number 1 spot on this list of honorable mentions for my top 10 extinct British steam locomotives list. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this first honorable mentions video. If you want to see more videos like these in the future, comment down below and subscribe to my channel. And if you're already subscribed, be sure to activate notifications so that you won't miss any future uploads like these. I'm Andrew Raila Bammers, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.
You're with the Flintstones.